I'd like to welcome you all here tonight. It's a great audience, have so many people here, to the 19th Leslie L. Schaffer Lecture. I'd like to tell you a little bit about Leslie Schaffer. It was started in 1981 by the late Mrs. Cato Schaffer for the purposes of disseminating scientific information and achievement among forestry students, professional foresters, scientists, and the public. The late Dr. Schaffer, in whose honor this lecture is named, played a very important role in the development of industrial forestry in Hungary, his native country, and after 1940 in Canada, where he initially worked for Pacific Veneer of New Westminster, and then started up Western Plywood, where he was the executive vice president. Dr. Schaffer felt very strongly about the importance of scientific research in forestry, and he considered that to be the basis of sound forestry practices, and so this lecture really represents a very fitting memorial to him. I'm very pleased that this evening we have members of his family here. He's represented by newly appointed Dr. Andrew Saxton, who recently got an honorary degree from the Justice Institute of BC, and his wife Sophie, and also by Barbara Grantham, his granddaughter, who is president of the VGH Foundation. I'm really pleased that the three of you could be here this evening, and really appreciate your continued engagement with our faculty. Tonight, I'm absolutely delighted to say that we have Professor Cecil Konijnendijk. Is that good enough?
It's pretty close, yeah.
For those of you who've actually seen his name written down will realize what a challenge it is to try and pronounce it. Cecil is a Dutch national, but he is based in Sweden, where he holds the post of the head of the Department of Landscape Architecture, Planning and Management at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. He's also a part-time professor of green space management at the University of Copenhagen. No idea how you manage to be professor in two different places at once.
It's a Brit.
Really difficult doing it in one place. He has an MSc in forest policy from the University of Wageningen in the Netherlands, and a DSc in forest policy and economics from the University of Joensuu in Finland. He's had a fairly varied career and has worked in all sorts of places, including Wageningen University, the European Forest Institute. He's had his own consulting firm, and what is not on this sheet, but I know you've also worked as a journalist for a while. During his career, Cecil studied and promoted the role of forests, trees, and other green spaces in urban societies. He has a special interest in the concepts of urban forestry and urban greening. And as many of you may know, we are introducing, touch wood, an urban forestry program here at UBC. I say touch wood because I'm not allowed to say we are definitely introducing it, because that's up to the BC government to decide. They have the proposal, they're sitting on it right now, and we're hoping that they will give us the feedback very shortly. He has a special interest in all aspects of urban forestry, and has been the founding editor of a major journal in the subject called Urban Forestry and Urban Greening. That's been going since 2002 and is an excellent journal dealing with urban forestry. He's got a long record of publications, over 250 scientific and professional publications, and has co-edited a textbook on urban forests and trees, and also a book called The Forest and the City, subtitled The Cultural Landscapes of Urban Woodland. He's involved in a variety of European projects and is here tonight to tell us something about urban forestry from, I think, a fairly global perspective. And I think his lecture will tell us why it is so important that we get our program in urban forestry up and running just as soon as possible. Thank you, Cecil.
Thank you. representatives of the Schaffer family. It's really a big honor for me to be invited to give this very prestigious Schaffer lecture, which is known, I think, across the world as one of the most prestigious lectures within the forestry field and the forest sciences field. So I'm really pleased to have that honor, not in the least, of course, because I know that UBC is one of the leading forest universities in the world, forest science universities in the world, and hopefully also within the next few years, one of the leading, or maybe the leading, urban forestry university of the world. And I think there's a lot of potential and a lot of signals that are pointing in the direction. And I think it's a very clever choice. Because what I'll try to do today is to show you that urban forestry is actually an extremely interesting field, not in the least for us with a forestry background, but also for people from landscape architecture, environmental psychology, biology, planning sciences, and even medical professionals. So I will try to highlight a little bit of how I have seen the field develop over the past years. And I will try to link it also a little bit to a perspective of forestry at large, which of course also has gone through a major journey during the last hundreds of years actually of its history. So a little bit more about where I come from. I come from something which we brand as SLU Landscape, and SLU is the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. And we are about 150 experts of landscape issues in Sweden, working with anything from urban forest and trees to rural landscapes. And it's a very interesting way, I think, for us to bring together people with landscape backgrounds. I'm very happy with this group of people where I'm leading part of one of the departments in that, but I think what we lack is actually foresters. We have only 2 foresters in this group of 150 people, and I'm one of them. So that's also one reason I think why UBC really can come in from this forestry perspective as well and team up with, for example, landscape architects and biologists and medical professionals and so to make a really truly interdisciplinary urban forestry program. So very exciting to hear a little bit more about that also during the week that we're here. I think I will start my lecture in a little bit of a maybe unusual way, but I would like to talk to you about happiness. Because I would argue that actually what we are doing as urban foresters is that we are in the business of creating happiness, usually. I mean, not everybody likes trees all the time, but in general, I would say that people like trees. And of course, when people like trees, we can actually use trees and forests in our cities to make them more livable, more attractive. And that actually can contribute directly, as we know from research, to people's well-being and happiness. So I'll start with that, and then I will also make a link from that to how forestry in general has been trying to link up to people's happiness. And that is a very interesting journey, because forestry, of course, has been very much a necessity, creating products from a more utilitarian perspective. But is also moving gradually, has moved over time towards a more socio-cultural perspective, and looking, for example, into things like recreation, health, aesthetics, etc. And then from that perspective, it's not so strange actually that this field of urban forestry emerged. And we should not forget, as I will get back to later, that actually the roots of urban forestry are here in Canada. I would have loved to say the roots of urban forestry are here in Vancouver, but they were in Toronto. But as we will see later, I think Toronto is also, unfortunately, losing a little bit of its urban forestry heritage, which is, of course, even better for Vancouver now and UBC to move in. So then I would like to sketch a little bit of the field of challenges and opportunities that urban forestry has today, making a few links also to, I think, the things that we could work with in the future across the world, and giving some idea of what kind of topics urban forestry 2.0 could possibly work with. So actually, many of you probably know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, of human needs. And of course, it's very much about, first of all, fulfilling our physiological needs. And in large parts of the world, of course, this is an extremely important part for people to be concerned with on a daily basis. We need, of course, food and water, we need shelter, etc. But from there, we also want safety. We want safe places for ourselves, and not in the least for our children to live. Then we also need love and belonging. We need to have a very strong social network together with us. We need to have family and friends. We need to have social relationships that are meaningful and actually add a meaningful layer to our life. But from that, we then also want to have esteem, self-esteem. We want to be appreciated. We want to do something which is meaningful in life. And if we actually achieve that, we can move up to the very top of the pyramid, which is something called self-actualization. And here we start talking about things like creativity, spontaneity, developing ourselves into happy and creative human beings. And as said, I mean, in large parts of the world, there's very much focus, of course, on the first steps of the pyramid, on the base and the next levels. While, of course, we in the Western countries usually don't really worry too much about those first levels, while we can think about self-actualization much more. well, trees and forests in general actually play in all these levels, of course. Anything from actually a basic necessity to make us be able to live, to something that actually can contribute to our creativity and well-being in general. So what is this thing called happiness? And one of the players on this photo is actually in the audience, which is our little daughter, Mai. And happiness, of course, I mean, for all of us, we have an idea when we are happy, don't we? I mean, you can feel it when you're happy and when you're not happy. It's quite obvious. But happiness is actually a whole sector, a whole research field of its own these days. So it's an emotion, of course, directly. I mean, when we're happy, we know it, we feel it. But it's also a way of how we assess our own lives. A lot of researchers across the world now come in and ask us, are you happy? And they do that in terms of asking us about our income, about our family relationships, about the kind of places we live. We know countries in the world, like Bhutan now, actually measure part of their wealth into national happiness, rather than just gross domestic product. So there's a lot of focus these days, I would say, on happiness and how we develop happiness and how can we create, for example, cities that promote happiness in a different way. And I know Vancouver is one of those cities where there's actually an explicit link or an ambition to create an optimal happiness for its inhabitants. So it's strived for by all, of course. I mean, if you ask people what you strive for in your life, I mean, people will say many things, but in the end, of course, one strives for happiness. For oneself, but of course also for the people around oneself. And it's even known, of course, as a human right. If you think about the American Constitution, it's very much stating this thing, that every single human being has the right to strive for its own happiness. It's a human right to be happy, or at least to strive for happiness. Well, I want to take you on a little bit of a sidestep here. I mean, in Europe, we have a lot of these stories, like this one here from the German Democratic Republic, the old former eastern part of Germany, where happiness was maybe not always so easy to find for people. And one of the reasons why happiness was not so easy to find was that it was very difficult to get a car. I mean, here in North America, of course, a car is a very big part of human life, and happiness as well. But in the German Democratic Republic, people were on the waiting list for 5 or 10 years to get this wonderful little piece of Eastern German technology called a Trabant. It basically ran like a, I don't know, not much. It was made of plastic, large part of it, but people wanted it. It was the only kind of car they could get. So what happened then in 1989 when the wall came down in 1990, people actually started to get in their Trabant, they all looked the same, and they drove to the west. And what they tried to find there was happiness. But happiness was reflected in things like this. The Kaufhaus des Westens was the big department store in West Berlin. So people could go there, walked into the department store, and just couldn't believe their eyes. The variety of products, of opportunities, the bright lights. Maybe they start mistaking happiness for consumerism and capitalism, of course. But on the other hand, one can understand it when the choices are very limited. Of course, the one thing that can be strived for is diversity and a greater amount of choice. And that actually has a little bit to do with the thing as well, that we in general in society today appreciate diversity. I mean, if I look across this audience, very much so, of course, we're a very diverse group of people here. It's something that many societies, many political systems in the world today say is actually a good thing to do. And not only politically, but when we look at the biological sciences, ecology, etc., it's also saying basically diversity is good for us. It can make us more resilient. It can actually build societies, I mean animal and plant societies, but also human societies that are more versatile, that are better places to live, that can make us more happy. You'll be surprised, as I say, how many people today are actually researching into happiness. This is an independent report that came out a while ago, and you might recognize some of the names. John Halliwell, Jack Sachs. They started to look at what kind of happiness rankings do we have across the world, and how do we measure happiness in a constructive way. And this is very small, but actually the top countries in the world in terms of happiness, in terms of looking at people's income, in terms of people's opportunities to develop themselves, family relations, etc., almost always in these happiness rankings, Denmark comes out number 1. I mean, having lived in Denmark for 11 years, I'm flabbergasted. I really don't understand it. The Danish men have the shortest life expectancy of all Northwestern Europe. I think they die, what is it, Matilda, 3 years earlier than the Swedes, or 4 years earlier than the Swedes. Yeah? That could be one reason, of course, because they really live happily and they like drinking and they eat a lot of fat food and so. But if you ask the Danes, they have actually a word for it. It's called hygge. Hygge means to be social together with each other, to be social with friends and family, to bring a crate of beer to the forest, sit there with your family and enjoy it. But I mean, you see also the other Scandinavian countries, Switzerland, Canada as well, number 6. So you see these things. And I mean, one of the things that I feel, being Dutch, coming from a country which is maybe a bit less natural in its focus, you see all of these countries on top also have quite vast natural resources in terms of landscapes, mountains, seas, forests, etc. Well-off countries, big GDPs, etc., but also very well taken care of some of their natural resources. Some Canadian writers have been looking into this happiness issue as well, and they say, for example, the focus should really be on our cities. You think about that 80% of the population, the world's population, will soon live in cities. It's already more than 50% today. And then, of course, focus should be on cities. And as Charles Montgomery here says, we have to start retrofitting our cities for happiness. Because many of our cities today are actually pretty lousy places to live, or at least suboptimal. Even cities like Vancouver that score always in the top 5 or 10 of happiness and well-being rankings, of course, have issues to be dealt with. Traffic situations, some parts of the city may be not looking so nice, or where part of the population is not actually feeling so happy. So it is really a big challenge for us, I think, to deal with cities, especially in terms of creating happy places. And this, of course, the contrast to that. In the industrial era, both in Europe and in North America, cities are really terrible places to live. Dirty, people were living in very small areas with big families, they didn't become very old. When they got their money on the Friday or the Saturday, the guys went out immediately and drank all of it in the pub. So at that stage, politicians started to realize, well, if we want to make people happy, if we want to keep a healthy workforce, we have to think about something to do here. We can't just have people live like this. So they started realizing, of course, that, for example, we need parks. Because what's good with parks, you can put people in there, they can enjoy themselves, they're outside, they get healthy air, they play with their family, they're physically active, and hopefully they won't drink too much either. So what a contrast then to the kind of places we're creating today. Yeah? This is Phoenix, Arizona, and I mean, we know it also from Canada, we know it from Europe, we know it from many other places. Suburbia is still very much present. And it gives us all, in a very democratic way, a nice piece of land, a nice house, a nice road to drive on. But really, I mean, is this kind of happiness creation that we're looking for? Is this the kind of happiness people strive for? To have this kind of areas? Is this the kind of place we want our children to grow up in? Because there are consequences to this, of course. Obesity, which is becoming a huge issue all across the world. People don't move, they are not physically active, they have very sedentary lifestyles, both at work and in private circumstances. Canada is also facing that issue, of course. But even places in Asia that have traditionally had very healthy lifestyles, healthy food patterns and so, see Korea, for example, they're really facing now this obesity challenge. Aging is another issue. I mean, it's not related as such with suburbia or so, but I think we have to face that a large part of our population today is actually over 65. And these people have different kind of demands on our cities, on our infrastructure. They may not actually want to use the city in the same way. They need green spaces, etc. So that brings me to the link, as I said before, to trees and forests. And one aspect of happiness, of well-being, that we should not overlook is that people have very strong connections to trees. This is a photo from Anuradhapura, the old capital of Sri Lanka, where there's a very strong connection between religion, people, spirituality, and well-being. And trees and forests, of course, have played a role in many cases. They've actually helped us keep us connected to nature, even in the most urban of areas. They've helped us keep healthy in many different ways. And forestry has, to some extent, tapped into those more spiritual, aesthetic, cultural relationships. But in many ways, it hasn't really. I mean, those of you studying forestry today, I think you're well off, because you will be taught, hopefully, a lot of topics that have to do with social sciences, with planning. Even the word happiness might creep into your education in some way. Well, many of us were studying forestry in the 90s, and maybe even before that. Of course, it was very much focused on economic aspects, being outside of the city as far away as possible. I know in British Columbia that's not so difficult, but in Holland, where I studied, that was actually quite impossible. But even there, we were not taught anything about urban areas. We were told about forestry outside. And of course, then we also had this kind of images in our heads about the dark side of the forest and all the bad things that happen there. And sometimes I feel almost this kind of old stories like Little Red Riding Hood, they were kind of a conspiracy of the forest profession to keep people away from the forest. Of course, not true, but there is something to it. I mean, this frontier spirit that you also have had in Canada, where the forest was actually an obstacle, had to be cleared, we had to get rid of it in order to create our cities or create agricultural land. So this forest idea of spirituality, of connection, it did exist, but it exists on a very shallow level in many cases. But that changed over time. And the first people who changed it were actually people of noble backgrounds, nobility, kings and queens, the bourgeoisie, etc. And they started feeling, we need to keep some of this forest. We need to keep it, not in the least because we need our hunting areas. We need to be able to go there for our pleasure and hunt deer, etc. This is the Jägersborg Deer Park close to Copenhagen. And this is also when you see that actually the roots of forestry start emerging. John Evelyn Silva, for example, starts to write down in a more systematic way, how do we take care of those forests? How don't they all become frontier, areas to be destroyed? How do we deal with a sustained yield principle in forestry? People like von Karlowitz and other German foresters from those days, they started really thinking about developing sustainable principles for forestry. Sustainability today, of course, has a much wider scope than what these guys were thinking about. They were thinking very much about continuous yield, sustained yield of timber. And if we were lucky, we'd get some of the other benefits like biodiversity and maybe social services in their wake. Of course, that changed over time. So when I started studying in Wageningen in the late 80s, we know, of course, also from North America, there were all other kind of thinkers that had been around by then. People like Gifford Pinchot and John Muir, who had started to change the whole idea about forestry. It was not only about timber production. It was also about taking care of our resource, about stewardship, about making sure that we also tapped into that kind of spirituality and kind of cultural link that we had with the forest. So my image becoming a forester when I was 18, 19 years old in the Netherlands was very much based on some of those thoughts, but also very much still this thought. Being out in the forest on my own, enjoying it, enjoying its nature, maybe having an occasional visitor asking me for the way, but otherwise not too much human contact. What a long journey for an urban forester, won't you? Let's really imagine. I started reading, and I started getting really into some of the work, first of all, of a guy called Hans Leibundgut, a very famous Swiss forest professor from Zurich, who was writing about very interesting kind of mixing silviculture and cultural issues and talking about continued cover forestry, and that actually we don't have to cut all the forest, but we can actually do it in a very creative way, and also tapping into poetry and all the other very interesting issues. So he started leading the way for me until I came across this guy, Jack Westerby, who was working with FAO in those days. And there was one sentence in his book, Introduction to World Forestry, which was the key source or reading book that we had to use in the Netherlands. All forestry should be social. And when he wrote this sentence, it was actually quite revolutionary, and he was criticized heavily for it. What do you mean all forestry should be social? Is it more about people than about trees? And he said, yeah, actually, yes, that's it. It is very much about community forestry. It's about connecting people and trees. So I would say, in a way, when we think about forestry as it is today, Jack Westerby has been the founding father also in some way of urban forestry, because he actually helped us foresters to start thinking about socio-cultural issues in a much more different and integrated way. So I studied forestry and I read up on Westerby and I started getting into the urban issues as well, and I came across other books that were heavily critical of forestry and started telling us, a lot of the things you're doing in forestry are actually not exactly right from a societal perspective. Hunting dominates very strongly, for example, in Germany, and in Sweden there's a lot of talk about clearing some of the forest that we should maybe not clear. One can think about these books what one thinks, of course, but I think it's very good to have this kind of debates, and they really started putting forestry in a very different perspective. What happens, though, unfortunately, is that forestry then starts often become very defensive and wants to take the argument in a way that's maybe not always so constructive. Well, I think, then, on the other hand, there are actually very good ways for forestry to go in and be proactive and be very positive and optimistic about some of the things it can deliver. Because we have so much good to tell. Sustainability, long-term thinking, ecology, social forestry, and of course, not in the least, urban forestry. Because this is the new frontier, of course. Cities being expanded all over the world into our forests. This is in Brazil. Forests are disappearing. Or maybe in some cases, forests are being transformed into a new kind of forest, an urban forest. Or maybe not so new. This is a town in the Netherlands called Haarlem, which for 500-600 years has had a little piece of forest outside of its walls called the Haarlemmerhout. And the citizens have been extremely careful of keeping this forest. And whenever another foreign army, as they did in those days in the Netherlands, the Spanish came, the French came, the Germans came, everybody cut the forest, but in the end, of course, they replanted it. Because they felt it was such a strong part of their city identity, of their own local identity, that they had to keep it. So in a way, of course, urban forestry dates back to those days of the city forest, the town forest, the Stadtwald, as it's called in German. Places where...
This is, for example, what happened in this forest.
That's interesting.
The Dutch town.
I forgot to take the sound file out, I realized. Yeah, don't worry, you will only hear me a single voice here. But these kind of places started developing, and in Italy, for example, in the Renaissance times, that rich people started developing this kind of villa gardens, imitating nature, trying to bring nature into the city, trying to improve nature in a way as well, as they said. Landscapes for forests were important, but also open land, etc. And urban forestry started developing, although it was not called urban forestry. This is the Zielwald in Zurich, where in those days, as it was of course, influential citizens went to the forest a few times a year, had a good lunch, bit of wine, and then decided on what to do with the forest for the next half year. Cut a few trees, leave a few trees, have fun, grow a beard. The things foresters did. You see not a single woman on this picture. Another thing that really has changed in forestry, luckily, over time. Urban forest became very important. Places like Berlin, this is West Berlin in the times of communism. Basically, people couldn't go anywhere. They had their own little island in the middle of Eastern Germany. But what they had is this big forest called the Grunewald. And you could go there on a Saturday or a Sunday, go into the heart of the Grunewald, and pretend that they were in a big German forest somewhere else. So urban forests are very important, and they started becoming more and more important. But surprisingly, when you look at the same time at how forestry is developing, there's very limited attention to these kind of forests. We just do business as usual. Now, we don't have to adapt forestry to these kind of circumstances. And you see also there, of course, conflicts start emerging because people say, well, hey, why are you doing this to my forest? Why are you cutting my trees? We have come a long way, of course, in that sense. This is Stanley Park here in Vancouver. At least part of it. And the city of Vancouver was one of those cities that was actually quite visionary and realized if we want to make innovations, if we want to be competitive, if we want to really develop our competitiveness also in the future, if we want to be a good place for people to live, a happy place, we need to keep some of these resources we have. We have to protect Stanley Park. Other cities around the world did similar things, but maybe not on the scale that Vancouver actually realized to do. Quite exceptional in its kind of vision. In other cases, like here in Copenhagen, maybe people didn't have Stanley Park. So they protected single trees. Maintained them in the middle of the squares, put them in maybe a few hundred years ago. This is the most expensive tree in Copenhagen, as I always say. It really makes a lot of impact, you can imagine, even on a winter day here in Copenhagen. So we started protecting our trees, our forests, our parks in cities. We started developing something we can call urban forestry today, what was definitely not called urban forestry before. But we also started dealing with a lot of issues there in terms of our urban green spaces. We see, of course, that urbanization continues, so we lose land, we lose green space. We face high maintenance costs, especially when trees, for example, get older. Maybe the functions of those parks and trees is not the same today as it was in the old days. We get hit by diseases, pests and diseases, like, for example, Dutch elm disease, sweeping through North America in the 1940s and afterwards. They really started challenging the way we deal with our own green space and urban trees. Climate change, of course, is another one. All of a sudden, the trees that we have in our cities can't survive because it's too warm. So a lot of issues that we have to face. People's changing perceptions, people want to be involved, etc. Just a few of the nice little critters that are sweeping through our urban forests these days. Either in North America, in Europe, in Russia, wherever you can imagine. And they look wonderful, of course. They're very aesthetic, but maybe not the kind of critters you want into our urban forest. So in those when these kind of issues start emerging, then there's also kind of a drive, of course, to develop new ways of dealing with these in a more constructive, more integrative way. And in the late 19th century, some people in the US started talking about urban forestry, very incidentally. So to be honest with you, I mean, it was not actually a Canadian who coined the term urban forestry in 1965, as we all learn in urban forestry class. It was actually somebody in the city of Cambridge, I think, in the US, who started playing a bit with the words of urban and forestry. And of course, it is kind of a contradiction in terms, isn't it? Urban and forest. I mean, for ages and ages, forestry has been developing aside from the city. Sure, the city provided its customers, but ideally we should not have too much interaction. And when you were studying forestry in different countries across the world, you didn't learn about urban for sure. It was not important. It was all rural, etc. But of course we also know from literature and poetry that there are these kind of connections always, to quote a famous Canadian here, about urban and forest, and city and forest, and the kind of love-hate relationships these two have had. And that is when urban forestry emerged, in the 1960s in North America. And people like Eric Jurgensen and Bob Miller in the US, they started coining it and defining it and playing with the words and telling their graduate students to go out there and actually do something called urban forestry. Something about all these tree resources in and around the city that could provide all these different benefits to society. And taking a kind of as some foresters once told me when I was at my first IUFO Congress, taking a kind of a Mickey Mouse approach to forestry. Very nice, they said, very nice you're doing this kind of fluffy stuff. Very good, do it, but the main business of forestry is not urban forestry. It's nice to get in there, you know, to maybe chase out some of the landscape architects, but so this is really the kind of attitude I faced when I studying urban forestry. Forestry was not interested in this. Absolutely not. And it was because it was just too fluffy. It was no money to be made with it. Then we have to start teaching students in a very different way. We're not interested in that. But many of us started taking up the challenge and started creating groups of urban forestry, networks, platforms, meetings, etc. Linking up from Europe to our North American counterparts, starting also to make inroads towards Asia, China, Japan, Malaysia, countries that were really interested in urban forestry. And we started in Europe trying to make our own way of dealing with urban forestry, defining it in a very inclusive way, saying that everybody who has an interest in urban trees and urban green space, you're very welcome to be part of urban forestry. We have to work together because we need you landscape architects with your visionary approach to land use planning, with your visualization skills, with your ways of really bringing people together in a very innovative way of communication. We need also you social scientists to tell us what people want. And we need you economists to tell us what it's all worth. But not in the least, we also need you foresters. Because you can bring in your long-term perspective, your ecology, your multifunctionality, you know about your trees. So these kind of issues started emerging. We wrote books, we started setting up journals, etc., trying to tell people when we went to conferences and showing this kind of pictures, that this is also a forest. No, this is a city. No, actually this is a forest. Trondheim, Norway, canopy cover of 35%. FAO definitions say an area of 20%. Canopy cover is a forest. So where does the city end? Where does the forest start, etc.? And of course in the US, just to the south from here, urban forestry really started developing into a mega program. They got the support from the national government. The US Forest Service developed its own urban forestry branch, research stations, funding programs with every state having an urban forester. They had the backup here as well of organizations like American Forest, strong NGOs that actually could drive the urban forestry agenda. Funding being pumped in, research being developed, etc. In Canada, that has been a little bit different. So we had Eric Jurgensen, he's right there on the top, coining the term. Very nice, of course, the connection with the Scandinavians, him being Danish, moving to Canada, talking about urban forestry. There's a lot of good initiatives that have been taken, for example, by Tree Canada. But you're still looking for kind of a massive movement, I would say. There's still lacked an absence of federal support for urban forestry. It's still very much kind of individuals trying to get together and try to generate a kind of a movement of urban forestry, a research community. I know that the Canadian Urban Forestry Conference is actually now really starting to kick off. And there was a conference in Victoria just a few months ago where people who were there, I was unfortunately only there on video link, they started telling me, something is happening in Canada. Urban forestry is actually coming of age. Finally there's kind of a movement here. There's PhD students, there are schools that are getting into this, there's some at least provincial or local interest in this, but we're still lacking good urban forestry education in Canada. So hooray, here comes UBC and picks up the gauntlet and starts to develop it. I think it's absolutely the right time to do this. Because of course you have a wonderful heritage in Canada. This is Vancouver here, just a few days that we have been spending here with the family. The city, of course, has a lot of urban forest heritage. Stanley Park as well. Even when you go on to the most urban parts of the city, trees are everywhere. Green roofs. Can always be more. I'm meeting the mayor on Friday. I will tell him, of course, that there can always be more. Definitely. But for sure, Vancouver is one of those cities that has a very strong urban forestry base. And in its efforts to promote livability, competitiveness, because it's really a tough world out of there if you want to attract talent and funding, etc., you have to be competing on every single arena. But don't forget the urban forest heritage, I would say. It's wonderful with the landscapes around, of course, the mountains, the sea, etc. But don't forget this single urban tree also in the street, because they really help connect people with nature on a very local level. So let me bring it then to this urban forestry 2.0 and how we can work with it. Because I think urban forestry has done a lot of good things, but we also made our mistakes over time. We're planting the wrong trees. We're not really good in creating diversity in our cities. So in some cities in the Nordic countries, 50% of all the trees are 1 or 2 species. Well, of course, that's an open invitation for a disease to hit, like it did with Dutch elm disease. Wiped out 40% of Copenhagen's trees in 10 years. Talk about a challenge, of course. So we have to be clever about this. I mean, if I have to pick, I decided to just pick 3 topics that I see are emerging as urban forestry topics that we can work with, that can build bridges, that can develop urban forestry in a new way. It's ecosystem services and delivering green infrastructure. It's governance and its resilience and biocultural diversity. And in Europe, at least, I know it's the same in North America, there's a lot of talk now about green infrastructure, about creating green nets, an infrastructure of green space and trees that actually contributes to the city's sustainability in many different ways. And you can say, I know, it's not a big deal, what is new with green infrastructure? Well, the thing is, the term green infrastructure starts speaking a different language. Starts talking to the planners and the engineers. Start talking about green being at the same level as water, as being roads, sewage systems, etc. And there's also a risk in that, I think, because if we start talking about green infrastructure, the man or the woman in the street will have no relationship to it. If I go to downtown Vancouver tonight and ask people, hey, what do you think about Vancouver's green infrastructure? I doubt if people really would have a very personal connection. But if I would ask them, hey, how do you feel about Stanley Park? Sure, I get loads of interesting responses. So there's a risk, I think, with green infrastructure, but it's a very good thing to at least raise the issue of green to a very different kind of political arena. Because urban forests are essential. This is the city of Beersheba in Israel. Of course, trees play a very different role in terms of being essential. And some countries in the world have started to explore those really important ecosystem services provided by urban forests. Like in the UK, where there's a nationwide community forest program, 12 quite struggling urban areas in the UK, they actually use trees and forest planting to turn around the whole mentality people had towards their own environment. From being very depressed, industries going down, etc., to having kind of a hope about the future. Because trees, of course, are one of the really strong symbols for hope and development. And on different scales, I mean, some cities maybe don't have to provide hope as such, but they can still provide very interesting new initiatives, like the High Line here in New York. Out of a maybe not so interesting area, the number 2 tourist attraction in New York has emerged now after Central Park. People want to go to the High Line, and people want to build a house next to the High Line. Loads of, I mean, they make calculations that every single dollar invested in the High Line, I think, has generated 30 times the income in terms of investment and tourism, etc. And we're still, I mean, this is early days still of the High Line. So is this it then? Is this ecosystem services that we're going to strive for? Can we try to monetize them? Can we put a monetary value on every single service that urban forest and trees provide? Well, some people, of course, have been trying that. People like Constanza here, in this famous article in Nature, they really try to put a money value on everything, coming to a kind of a super total sum for all of the world's ecosystem services. And I think when you start talking in the trillions and whatever it is, of course it makes no sense anymore. I mean, the idea is very good though, because these politicians, they like to hear numbers, they like to hear monetary values. And this is also fed into urban forestry. I mean, the work that is done by people like David Nowak and Greg McPherson in the US has also come to Canada with iTree, etc., trying to really get an idea, what is it actually, what do we have? How many trees do we have in our cities? What kind of functionality do they have? Can I put a monetary value on these benefits that the trees provide? There's Dave. So iTree is one of those tools. But again, I mean, it's very good. It has very good, very strong components to it. But does it capture any of these happiness factors? Does it talk about happiness? Does it talk about aesthetics, human health? Does it talk about social relationships, inspiration? It's very difficult to capture those issues. But I would argue, in some way, even more important than all these environmental services that we are focusing on. We did some efforts around the world. I've been involved in projects in Russia, in Malaysia, in China. We tried to show to politicians the value of their local urban forests. And we tried, of course, very hard. I wish I would be able to tell you this was a success story, a little forest near Kuala Lumpur. We made a big calculation of the value of the forest if it would not be cut for a residential area. 2 years later, of course, it was cut. Not so that every story has a happy ending. But at least it raised some awareness, I think, among politicians that this is not just a resource that can just be taken away because it has no value. Just to give you one little example of how actually some of these values of urban forest are very difficult to measure. This is a master's student of mine, Trine Plambeck, in Denmark, in Copenhagen. And Trine came from a very interesting background. She worked with innovation and IT. And she came to study landscape, to be a landscape architect. I mean, I heard also here in UBC you have a very similar tradition of actually people streaming into the landscape architecture master from very different backgrounds. And it's a challenge for many people because they have to start learning to draw and to visualize, and it's really a steep learning curve. And it was also so for Trine. But she struggled through and did well, and then in the end she said, now I know exactly what I want to do for my master thesis. I want to talk about innovation, I want to talk about creativity. And she had a network of artists and writers and actors in Denmark. She said, I want to interview those people. I want to study what impact nature has on that creative process. Where does nature come in? As they started showing them different kind of environments, among which, of course, forest environments in Denmark like this, the beech forest of the Danes, scored very high in terms of what these creative people felt was extremely important for them when they were in their creative phase. And they talked very much about this first phase of being creative, this kind of idea forming, incubation phase, when you have to also disconnect from all your kind of worries and other feelings. That's when they went to nature. They went to the forest or they went to the sea. And they all agreed. There was none of them. I mean, these are people from very different backgrounds. Big actors, sculptors, jewel makers. They all said the same thing. We need the nature for our creativity. I can't just sit in my office. I can't just sit at home. I can't just be in the city. I have to be out. I have to be at least in the park to be creative. So these thoughts are filtering through. And this is not only anymore about hardcore ecosystem services and putting monetary value on it. It's about biophilia, about how we as human beings can get stronger actually by connections with nature. And that we actually have this kind of genetical connection, of course, to nature and to certain landscapes. People like Timothy Beatley are working on these issues and trying to push agendas to city governments across the world. And it brings me to the second topic, which I think is really making inroads now, and that's governance. Where in forestry in general, as well as in urban forestry, you see a shift away from the government deciding on everything, or maybe some private owners. You see a wide range of actors being involved in how we decide about urban trees and urban forests. So you see communities as well as the business sector going into partnerships with local governments and national governments. And you see very interesting initiatives emerging, like hybrid parks that are co-managed, co-owned by the private sector, by local communities, by public agencies. Central Park is, of course, a prime example. It's co-managed by the Central Park Conservancy, which is a private organization, an NGO, together with the New York City Park Department. So we'll see more of this, I think, also in our urban forest. And in Europe, we're very scared of that. We don't like commercializing of our forest and our urban parks, but I think it's going to happen more and more. One of the best pieces of urban forest research and publishing that has come out of Canada during recent years, I think, is this book, Urban Forest, Trees and Green Space, based on a conference that was held in Toronto a few years ago. Very much going into the political, ecological power relationships between people and urban forest. Trying to see, well, whose urban forest are we talking about? Do the people in eastern Vancouver have the same kind of urban forest as the people here in downtown or in the west? Of course, there are differences there in how people are actually catered for in terms of, for example, tree canopy cover, quality of green space. And power issues, of course, are very strong. This is a little place where I did some research a while ago on the border of Palestine and Israel. There is an Arab city on the one hand, and then there is a Jewish settlement on the other side. And of course, very different ways of using the forest, very different cultural interactions between forest and people, and a lot of potential for conflicts about how the forest should be used and managed. And guerrilla gardening, I mean, I'm sure it's big in Vancouver as well. It's coming all across the world. And where people take the initiative themselves and don't trust public agencies anymore to take care of their green spaces. They have to green their own cities. Funny things emerging, people planting flowers next to street trees in different cities. Other people coming by and say, oh, the city is really doing a great job here putting plants in. But then the next day coming back, say, oh, the city is really lousy, they don't water the plants. So things like that do happen. Community gardening, of course, urban farming, yuppie farming, some people call it. I don't want to be derogative about it, but this is a place in Copenhagen, in the middle of a little bit marginalized area of Copenhagen. And then a group of well-off entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs came in and started doing community gardening. But what they didn't get was actually the local community on board. So it became a very strange type of initiative. But you see these things happening all across, of course. People want to grow their own foods, want to bring in different ways again of productivity and so in the city as well. This is another Canadian that has made quite an impact, originally from Colombia, Jill Penalosa, has also done a lot of work in Vancouver, I think. And he talks about a very simple principle. He says, if I can send my 8-year-old grandchild or my 80-year-old father on the streets of a city and will be without any problems, then the city will actually work well. So he uses, he says, 8 and 80-year-olds as indicator species of livability and happiness in the city, which is an interesting concept, I think. So then the third topic to end this up with is this whole issue of diversity and resilience. And of course, resilience in forestry is a big topic. In ecology as well, of course. We talk about this, the capacity to recover quickly from difficulties and toughness. I mean, that's also something we know from married life. Resilience, yeah. Now, of course, as human beings, we want to be resilient as well. You want to be adaptive. You want to be able to take a blow here and there. And some of us, of course, get stronger in it. Some of us really have more difficulty with it. But in general, it's something we strive for. We want to be resilient. We want to be able to deal with challenges. And in an urban forest, that means, first of all, we need often diversity of species. We can't just rely on these 2 or 3 species like we have done in many Nordic cities. We have to be diverse. We have to think about bringing in some of the principles of forest ecology into our cities as well. And maybe we can't use native tree species always. We might have to think about it. Actually, cities are not native environments. It's a big debate, native versus exotics, I know. But I mean, cities are not natural places to grow trees in many cases. So we may have to think differently when areas are actually 5 or 10 degrees warmer than the surrounding landscapes. And of course, resilience and so also requires management issues. We have to think differently about how to manage urban forests. We will need different kind of skills. We can't just do our usual one-size-fits-all approach to silviculture, or even 2 sizes fits all. We really have to think very carefully how we manage trees and forests in urban areas. And some cities actually are really trying to go down this road. This is Melbourne, Australia, that during the last years has set up a very strong urban forestry group, because they realize a lot of the old trees in Melbourne are dying. There's a lot of drought, a lot of climate change issues that are actually affecting their big trees, and they will have to take them all out in the next 10 years. That's a big step to do, of course, and people are not very happy with that. But how to turn that kind of dramatic situation into something positive? Talking about development, about creating a new urban forest for the future, a richer, diverse urban forest. Trying to bring home to people the message that actually urban forests produce all these kind of benefits, but it will only do it when they are also happy and healthy. And Melbourne, as said, is one of the cities that has really been doing a lot of work. And thinking in different ways here in terms of resilience as well and diversity, also bringing in the people aspect. Because for some of us, some areas, some green spaces are our own home environments. They're part of our identity, they're part of our place. While other areas may be spaces that we actually want to explore, a little bit dangerous, a little bit adventurous, the children can go and explore for the first time. And we actually need both. We need both the places that are close to our heart and the spaces that are challenging and giving us a chance to explore nature in different ways. So that's where concepts like biocultural diversity start emerging. Where we say, why do we still separate biological issues, biodiversity, from all the social and cultural issues? Why are we still talking about different disciplines that hardly talk to each other, published in different journals? Why don't we bring these people together? Why don't we start talking a similar language? Talking about something like biocultural diversity. Because of course in our cities, for example, the way we manage our parks, the way we create our parks and green spaces and urban forests is not just biodiversity. It's very much dependent on the cultural diversity, the local communities that exist there as well. So we have to bring those two together. And these concepts, as in many cases, have actually emerged in developing world and starting now to be implemented also in the Western world, especially in cities. And we're working with this in a European project called Green Search, where we work together with people from 11 different countries, trying to say, okay, what does this mean? We talk about things like creating biocultural diversity, local communities taking care of their own urban forests. We talk about people that we can call biocultural creatives. I mean, we're all biocultural creatives. We all plant trees. We all manage our gardens. We're all creating the biocultural diversity of the future. So we work a lot with these kind of issues. We try to map it. We try to assess biocultural diversity. And I think it's one of those concepts that really starts becoming kind of a fundament, I think, of urban forestry in the future as well. So I've come to the end of my brief journey to urban forestry, linking up to forestry, which is also my own background. By saying here, I would say that urban forestry is at the forefront of forestry in many different ways. It has really, after Westerby and some of the other people who have actually promoted social issues, really taken up the challenges that forestry can be very social. It can actually be very social, very culturally based, and it can actually tell other natural resource professionals also how to develop trees and forests that can provide happiness and well-being. But of course we need to find our own way. I mean, urban forestry is up to many challenges. other fields emerge, other professions also feel they want to be part of this. So we have to rethink our role. We have to see how we link up to, for example, ecosystem service provision, sustainable cities, green infrastructure. And we have to focus on some of these issues that I've been talking about, ecosystem services, biocultural diversity, resilience, as well as governance. I think if we take up that challenge, be it here at UBC, in Canada, but also across the world, we can build a very strong group of interdisciplinary thinkers, workers, practitioners, bioculture creatives that can hopefully create some of the sustainable, livable, and happy cities of the future. Thank you very much. Absolutely.
Well, thank you very much for that fascinating presentation. Cecil's kindly agreed to answer questions. I might pose the first one.
All right.
Is urban forestry just a glorified form of arboriculture?
Oh, no. Very good point, John. And in the history of urban forestry, I think there's been two big struggles. One has been the struggle that I talked about between forestry, either not going into urban areas. And a lot of foresters considering urban forestry kind of second-rank forests. I think the second struggle is very much arboriculture versus urban forestry. Unfortunately, because arboriculture is an extremely important part, I would say, of developing urban forestry. It's talking about single trees, taking care of them, and of course that's kind of the roots of urban forestry in many ways. But it's absolutely right that there has been a struggle over time of arborists and urban foresters actually maybe sometimes not even talking with each other, which is a big shame because we need each other. But it's a very fair question.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting.
Okay.
I grew up in Switzerland. My parents are Israeli though, and so I've been working in peace activism at the university. And we said that the different uses of forestry, forgive me for rephrasing, on either side of the border conflict can lead to conflict. Do you see the appreciation for forests on either side of the border and the possibility for peace?
Very good point. Actually, excellent point. Yes. When I worked in Israel for a while, I worked with KKL, the kind of privatized Israeli forest service, one can say. And they had a very strong program at that stage called community forestry, where they exactly wanted to do this. Working with tree planting, community forestry to bring people together. And I saw some really good examples of that. Because in the end, as you say, both religions, for example, have very strong links to trees and forests. Both want to go out with people. I mean, they're very similar kind of social use of forests. So absolutely. I mean, the potential for conflicts, I think, is very much related to maybe prioritizing different uses. But turning it around, I think, is an excellent opportunity for people to meet. And they worked especially very much with young people, youths, bringing them together, enjoying forests together. So thanks for that point. Very good. Yeah.
So in North America, we get a lot of insects and disease. Obviously, I can think of a number of even new examples that most people probably don't even know about. So you mentioned that, and you mentioned planting other species people may not want because they're not native. So I'm wondering, is the solution part of this to maybe plant, let's say, Manchurian ash instead of black ash, or elm in another case? We have a couple of those, or maybe an American chestnut where we could plant. A Manchurian chestnut is resistant. So do you think that that's what we do? We take trees where there's a lot of invasives and bring them here?
So the question is very much about how to deal with this. I'm not sure if everybody could hear it. About how to bring in diversity in cities, and in some cases maybe we need to use exotic species of a similar background. It's a very tricky question, very interesting question. We had a big conference last year in Alnarp on urban tree diversity. Brought in people from all over the world talking about diversity from different perspectives. And I mean, the debates were very heated, you can imagine. I think pragmatically speaking, a lot of research now is looking at exactly the kind of issues you're talking about, trying to look at other parts of the world in the same climate zones and so, and try to bring in trees from there. I spoke with a forester in Iceland once, and he said, in Iceland nothing grows, so any tree that grows in Iceland is welcome. It's a pretty pragmatic approach, but there's a very good expert on this, Ingo Kowarek, a professor in Berlin, and he's a very pragmatic person. He says, yeah, exotics, we've always had exotics in our cities, but we have to work with them very carefully, test them very carefully, learn our lessons, as we not always do. And then I said, yeah, there is a role for exotic species. There has to be, but in a very clever way, and maybe not everywhere. But, yeah, good point. I think it's one of those, I didn't put it up exactly that, but of course, I think it will be one of the big questions for urban forestry for the next 10 to 20 years.
Gordon, have any comment on forest bleeding?
Forest bathing, yeah. Some of you may be familiar with forest bathing. This is an Asian, Japanese, Korean concept where people actually go out to the forest and take it as a bath. So they actually soak in the atmosphere. And actually it's seen really as a health-promoting exercise, very widely accepted, even prescribed by doctors and so. And of course, the basic idea is it's not so strange. We know when you're very stressed, similar for you, many of you, I think, what better to do than go out to nature? If there's not a big mountain area nearby, maybe a local park and so. So it promotes, of course, our mental well-being. We're physically active. And that's the idea, to be immersed in a forest environment, to be connected to nature, actually as a health-promoting benefit. So there's some interesting research coming out of Asia. I'm not exactly always sure about all of the work, but it really promotes this kind of, it shows the benefits of people actually having lower blood pressure, less stress, etc. Plus there's this whole kind of natural connection, educational issue to it as well.
I should point out that tomorrow morning, there will be a presentation by Matilda Vandenbosch, who is the better half of Cecil.
Absolutely, much better.
And she is going to be talking about nature and public health. And that will be at 9 o'clock, I believe, or is it 9:30? 9 o'clock in room B151 of the School of Population and Public Health in East Mall.
Highly recommend it. Matilda is actually a medical doctor who made a very clever decision to go out of the medical field into the landscape field. So she's very welcome. Yes, please.
Yes, I was working in that little Berlin forest for a while.
You were? Okay, yeah.
Yes, and I could see that the reconnection to nature was, in a way, for us foresters, a big problem because we were almost unable to do any forest work in the forest because the public was against everything that we have done. So
it's an issue. Yeah, there's the issue that many urban foresters actually from across the world have told me the same story. They said, it's so frustrating that when we want to manage our forest and make it look nice, then always the people complain about it because nobody wants us to cut anything. And it's a big issue, I realize it. And I think it's partly, of course, it's a public education issue, communication issue. A lot of people in urban areas, they're disconnected from nature. Maybe it's not so much here in Vancouver because you have so much nature around you. But people don't see the need for trees to grow. They say, trees look nice as they are. Why don't we just keep them? So it's not always so clear for people that actually trees always can also die and fall over it. So I recognize the issue, and it is really a big topic. We have to, on the one hand, be communicative and develop public awareness raising. On the other hand, I think also develop new methods of how to manage forests and trees in a very different way. That's also, I think, why UBC really is the right place to start working with urban forestry. So, perfect.
Other questions? Yes.
Just a question in terms of the intersection between urban forestry and landscape design and architecture. I know in the city we're not super familiar about there's a new sort of tree ordinance where there's not allowed to cut certain trees and of a certain size, and I know this is going to cause conflict. How do you feel about sort of these top-down approaches to managing rather than creating more of a dialogue?
Right, so the question is very much about when you're dealing with cities, for example, enforcing tree ordinances or certain landscape planning approaches, and so how does that work in terms of maybe bottom-up approaches also colliding with it, I guess. I think it's a very important question, and in some ways, in some cases, one needs kind of top-down approaches. But of course, it's always better when you can get the kind of local community-based approaches to support them. And there is a potential for conflict there, especially when we talk about tree ordinances. And we all have examples of cutting the trees in our own backyard because they're just blocking the sun. But if there's tree ordinance telling us that we're not allowed to do it. Now, also in urban forestry, there's this NIMBY phenomenon that it's absolutely fine to cut your own tree, but definitely not the neighbor is allowed to do it. So there's an issue there, absolutely. But I think sometimes you need to be tough and top down. And I know, Vancouver has done a few of those things. I think it's, in some cases needed. Right.
One of the big pressures on the city of Vancouver now is densification.
Right.
And restricting land base for trees and their root systems. Do you have some city examples that come to mind where that particular challenge has been well met?
Mm-hmm. One comes to mind immediately, Stockholm has been working very actively with trying to improve its spacing of trees. In terms of having the right soil, having the right containers, taking out all streets, actually after the fact, putting in new soil and new containers. So I think that's actually a good example. You're welcome to get in contact with me and I can put you in touch with the people there. Copenhagen is starting to do this as well. So some of the Nordic cities, I think, are really trying to do it. There's good examples across North America, I guess, as well, of really treating. We're all facing this issue of densification. I mean, there's not a single city almost in the world that has an ambition at least to densify. But of course the question is, what do we lose with it as well? It's climate change mitigation issues, it's losing trees, losing quality. I'm a little bit worried when I hear this agenda all the time that we have to densify, because it's not always the best solution, I think.
Steve, and then
Could you comment on the essential components of an urban forester's education?
Yes, that's a very good question. Of course, a certain base of biological, ecological knowledge will always be needed, and it's very important. I mean, what I think, as I said, forestry has brought to urban forestry is very much the long-term ecological thing, looking at the system, which is, I think, very important. But I would say, I mean, no urban forestry program can survive without a good governance and policy component, social science component, communication component, planning, design component. I think one of the kind of secrets for urban forests is to be able to talk to other professions. To have, I mean, everybody around, and at least to be able to talk to the landscape architects, etc. Bring people in. So I would say it's very much towards the social, political sciences, apart from having a strong ecological base. And of course there are trade-offs there. You can't have everything perfectly. But,
And one of the practical arts of managing trees and roots.
absolutely. I think, I mean, of course, for one studies urban forestry, one has to have knowledge of that. When I studied forestry in the Netherlands, I think I had a chainsaw in my hands twice. So it's not a very practical education, but one needs to have the dirt under the fingernails as well, of course, and see. I mean, luckily I went out for 6 months with a tree crew in Santa Maria, California, and realized actually how it was to climb trees. And I'm extremely afraid of heights. So it was not my kind of time, but I learned a lot. So good point. Yeah.
I was actually wondering, like, some suburban communities in 20 years will look fairly nice, I guess. So there's that sort of like lag time.
Sure.
So, but is there, like, do you hit it at the design phase for urban forestry, or do you wait for your bulldozed land to grow up again and plant it like as you go over time?
It's a very good question. I'm very much a proponent. I've seen very good examples of actually putting in the green infrastructure, the urban forest first, trying to develop that, and actually then bringing in the urban development, which I think in many cases is very difficult because people then start reacting. Hey, we're losing our trees and so. But that will actually require different kind of legislation and maybe different kind of ways of looking at green space. Because I think actually green space can help create identity. There's a very nice example in Denmark, a city where they put in a local forest. But not only did they put it in, they actually brought in local residents that were actually buying houses and asked them to be involved in the whole planting and first management process. So they created a kind of a connection between the forest and the people from the start, which then developed over the next 10 to 20 years. People really started making their own urban forest. It looks crazy, really. You cannot imagine the kind of things people have done. But it's their forest, you know? So they're really happy with it.
I understand the primary objective of a lot of urban forests is happiness, health, kind of social aspects.
Right.
Are there any examples of urban forests that have been utilized for the actual fiber or wood that's present, and
Right.
trees at the end of the lifetime being harvested and utilized?
Thanks for the question. Actually, that was one of the things I think when I heard that UBC was very active now in developing its urban forestry program, I thought that's an excellent opportunity because I think urban forestry also needs to make that connection. It needs to show that actually trees are cut and used. And very good examples existing in Central Europe of cities that have had long relationships of managing the local forest, also for timber, also for other kind of products. So I think it's very important that we just don't get away from as you say, urban forestry just being about happiness, etc. We also make this kind of utilitarian production focus. And they don't exclude each other, I think. It's very interesting for children to go out to a forest when there's also management things going on. It's an educational opportunity for forestry at large, I would say. It's a kind of a shopping window for forestry as well. So thanks for that. Good point.
there's one there and then one over there.
What are some effective strategies for incorporating forests into growing cities, especially quickly growing cities? Developing world, especially.
Right. So the question is, what kind of strategies could we come up with to integrate forests and trees into rapidly growing cities? It's a very difficult question. We know it from all over the world that actually cities are expanding extremely dramatic, quickly. I think one is to try to at least reinforce the planning system, try to bring in some of the green infrastructure, make it compulsory in terms of development, but in developing countries it could be tricky. I think you really have to make the connection between the benefits of the trees, for the city also when it's expanding. Bringing the local communities that actually can, for example, grow their own food, their own gardens or their own little forest that actually can get products from, etc. That is really one of the challenges. And I mean, urban forestry, the whole developing aspect of urban forestry, developing country aspect of urban forestry, I think is another really important topic to look at. I hope UBC will also pick that up, because I think there's a huge potential in the world to develop urban forestry, specifically for the south. So really good point, and a very tricky question to answer. Right, yeah.
I'm wondering how can we build urban forests and promote this kind of the growth of trees and plants without displacing marginalized people?
It's a very good point, and actually it's funny you say it, because actually the forest, nice forest I showed you at Copenhagen, the hunting forest, was exactly the same story. So what the king did there, when he made his own little hunting forest, he kicked out 3 local villages, all the people out, and anybody who didn't want to leave was shot or killed. So of course there are issues there, absolutely. And that's actually one of the, like, let's say, black pages in the urban forestry history book, I think, that many of the good urban forests in the world are actually created on the expense of let's just say, marginalized people. People have been kicked out, etc., and have been protected by royalty, etc. We have to be aware of that. I think that's also why this whole field of political ecology and bringing that into urban forestry is extremely interesting, because it will actually raise some of these issues. And I think, I mean, for me, any urban forestry program should, of course, consider local communities, should bring them in, should really see what are the needs of the local community. That doesn't say that it's always easy to create urban forest according to their wishes, of course, but it's definitely an element that should be included also in any urban forestry curricula, I think. Political ecology and governance are really important topics there. Sorry? Yeah, yeah. Yeah, that's a very, so the question is, if you grow up in a green environment, are you more likely to protect nature, green space? Are you more natural, more biophilic, you could say? There is some research, isn't there, Matilda, that is actually confirming that people who actually grow up in more natural settings, natural environments, are more likely to be, let's say, more biophilic and more willing to protect natural areas. The funny thing is, though, of course, when you look in history of natural conservation movements, the people who actually started conserving nature were the urban people, let's say the better societies, bourgeoisie, etc. But there seems to be some connection there. I think research has been quite limited so far on that topic, but yeah, it's coming. Yeah, exactly. And there's some interesting work going on as well. And Matilda is working on some of these issues on looking at people's behavior, triggering people's behavior in terms of, let's say, biophilia or green response and so. So, very interesting issue to explore, I think.
Cities are often chosen in very productive areas.
Right.
And so far I couldn't mention anything about animals, birds, mammals, etc.
Right, yeah.
Some of the North American cities, they can be quite useful for migration pathways as well. So would your urban forestry program have a faunal component to?
Absolutely, should it be, I would say as part of the whole biodiversity agenda, it should of course be very strong. Not in the least because I think animals and plants also have this links to happiness in different ways. I mean, on the one hand, people appreciate seeing wildlife. On the other hand, of course, there are discussions about tick vector-borne diseases, and so they will also have to face. Some European cities are now starting to fear malaria coming back into the cities, for example. So there are these kind of two sides of the coins. But of course, I mean, we know big places, big green spaces, as well as green corridors in cities are very important for wildlife. So absolutely, I would have a spot ready there for for fauna in the program. Absolutely. There's a lot to cover in a few years, of course. Now. Yes, please. You have a question.
Yeah, I guess just regarding ecology, in a place like the city of Melbourne, they're aiming to double their tree canopy. Their biogeography really only supports about 10% canopy naturally. So innovative ways of harvesting water to grow the urban forest are being pursued. But what is your sort of perspective on that generally? Because places need urban forests to bring infrastructure, but they have to find ways to support them. So
Yeah. It's a very good question. I mean, if you go, for example, to the Middle East, and you go to places like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, and so the greenest, the most forested places are, of course, the cities. And they are not either supposed to be very green, of course. So they have a canopy cover which is way above the natural kind of two sides. I think one thing is that, of course, cities are not natural environments. So we live there as people, and as people we need trees around us. So it becomes a kind of an artificial issue. But of course, on the other hand, you can't just plant trees when the water, for example, is not enough. So there we have really interesting examples of, let's say, xerophyte vegetation. So we have less water requirements, etc. That I've seen, for example, in parts of the States. They have some really interesting programs there. But also Brisbane is an example of a city that has really been active, trying to really readdress its species composition. So yeah, definitely a good point. We have to, of course, be careful that we don't overstretch the system by planting too many trees either.
I found the most intriguing statement was focused on establishment, not maintenance. So what most cities are going through right now is just the cost of maintaining land.
Right.
Of trees. And so I'm just wondering if you have, or I guess what your thoughts are on that, because that's what we struggle with every day. And I think we
Yeah.
need tools to talk to politicians and to municipalities and city developers just to get past that, because that's probably the number one thing, the cost to maintain anything.
Very important, absolutely good point. And I think, I mean, talking about urban forestry failures, I think one of the failures we've had, so we have been too eager sometimes to jump on the wagon when it came to 1 million trees here, 100,000 here, etc. Because, I mean, it's very nice to plant trees and politicians love it, but how about, as you say, the maintenance issue? Do we get a bag of money with it to actually take care of those trees afterwards? Do we put in an endowment fund, or what do we do to... some cities are doing it now, so they actually put in a certain amount of funding when the tree is planted, put it away and say, okay, this is actually for the management in the future, but too few. And I fully agree with you. Also, when you go to New York City today, a lot of trees going in, and everybody talks about fantastic 1 million trees, but a lot of them are dying already. So, and I mean, it's not always easy to maintain programs like that. And maintenance is not a very sexy activity for many people. So, yeah, I see the dilemma, and I fully agree. I think it's number one probably management challenge we have today, to actually raise the profile of maintenance over just establishment. So thanks for that question, or that point.
Rob? You didn't mention much about urban trees as an adaptive mechanism for climate change.
Right.
Such as temperature reduction, such as stormwater improvement, air
Yes.
What are the roots of this?
Absolutely. I focus today very much on the more social-cultural side of things, but you're absolutely right. Trees, of course, are extremely important, as we know, as a mitigation adaptation mechanism. We talk about human health and well-being. Cooling the air, making our cities more resilient to climate change is an extremely important topic. So all the work with iTree and so is strongly based on the kind of climate agenda, trying to bring trees as a kind of an alternative way of reducing the impacts of climate change. So absolutely, it's a very important issue that we should not forget talking about happiness. But climate change and happiness go hand in hand as well, I guess. For some of us in colder parts of the world, climate change sounds very attractive, but there are, of course, implications to it.
Okay, I think we should probably close the discussion now. Cecil's going to be here for a few minutes, well, not a few minutes, for as long as it needs. Afterwards, I think the bar is still there. You're welcome to look at the posters, to ask Cecil questions on a one-to-one basis, or Matilda, if you're interested in the nature and public health aspects. Before we finish, we normally give a speaker a gift, but I'm going to break with that tradition. I have 3 gifts, and they are for 3 people. One of them is here. Yeah. I don't think the other 2 are here. And they're a bag of goodies about adaptive forestry. It's Cecil's 3 children. And I hope they will encourage them to come and study forestry here.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thanks so much, John. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks everybody for coming.